welcome to everyone. So tonight, as you all know, because you signed up for it, we've got an event which is part of a project called Bright Edge Deep, which is a collaboration between various people, and we'll all introduce ourselves momentarily, but I'll just spend a second introducing the project. My name's Gareth Beale, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight in a sort of light touch chair's role. And the reason I say light touch is because I know a lot less about peatlands than anyone else who you're going to hear from tonight. So I'm going to be the sort of cut price Melvin Bragg of the evening, trying to extract all of the exciting peatland information from the other speakers on your behalf. As you all know, this is part of the Glasgow University Festival of Archaeology, which is going on this week. And as a sort of precursor to the event tonight, I'm going to hand over to our head of subject and the organizer of the festival, Kenny Brophy, to tell us a little bit about what the festival is and what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, and some of you may have already seen me a few times this week already this evening, so thanks for coming along in such good numbers for this fantastic event. Yeah, so the festival, essentially the idea of the festival is at the end of a difficult period for all of us, and we've all been kind of remote from one another. It was to try and bring together the kind of a community of people who had a stake in the archaeology at the University of Glasgow. So the events that are happening have all been pitched and proposed by current and former staff and students. So there's live events running through the period of this week, next week, and the week after. And in fact, there's a few more live events for next week that are going to be advertised tomorrow. And there's also some pre-recorded lectures that I'm going to start putting on the website, and some other content as well. And also, I've been collecting together some wonderful images from former students of field trips from the 1980s, and staff looking much younger than they do now, and all sorts of things. So really, it's just really a kind of a celebration of Glasgow University archaeology, and not just the kind of the heritage and history of the archaeology department or subject areas we're meant to call it now, but also the kind of the cutting edge and exciting research that's currently going on just now as well. So there's a mixture of stuff. So for instance, tomorrow at 4 o'clock, there's a couple of talks by some colleagues from the honorary staff room, or the retired staff room, as I like to call it, talking about some of their ongoing research. So it's going from current staff to retired staff and to former staff as well. So I'm delighted to see so many people coming along to these events, and also it's been wonderful to be able to connect with our alumni, which is something we haven't really done at all for many years. So we've been able to communicate with over 500 former students to let them know about what this is happening, and many have been in touch. Many of you are alumni who are attending these events, and it's been great to see that engagement, and we hope to continue that engagement into the future as well. So hopefully this roundtable is a great success. I know that Nicki, whose idea this is currently trying to find somewhere with Wi-Fi that isn't a pub to join you all, and so enjoy this, and I'll hand you back to your host for just now, Gareth, with the wonderful shirt.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. Yeah, no, so I mean, I should say the reason Nicki is struggling to get Wi-Fi at the moment is because she's actually doing real field work at a peatland. So we can all forgive her, because she's doing the very thing we're going to be talking about tonight. So what I'll do first is give you a bit of an introduction to the project, which is called Bright Edge Deep, and what we're trying to achieve with this project. And then that'll give a bit of context to the very next part of the evening, in which I'll introduce all of the people, or allow all of the people who are going to be speaking tonight to briefly introduce themselves before we begin the first discussion. And I'll just give you a bit of context for the whole thing, and give you a sense of who you're hearing from when everyone's talking. Okay, so the Bright Edge Deep project started up a few months ago, I suppose now, a couple of months ago. And it was born out of a realization by various people at the University of Glasgow and elsewhere at other institutions, which we'll hear more about in a minute, that there were various people looking at the subject of peatlands, but from a whole range of different perspectives, really. This included archaeologists, it included art historians, it included artists and palaeoecologists and all kinds of different people who all brought something slightly different to the study of peatlands. And so it was a wonderful opportunity for interdisciplinary research and to understand from each other's perspectives what peatlands meant and why they were significant. And this was all really, I suppose, catalysed and sort of in anticipation of the COP26 climate summit, which is going to be in Glasgow later this year, and was sort of born out of a desire to contribute to dialogue around the significance of peatlands in advance of that, and to really highlight the importance of these landscapes, both in terms of understanding our past in an archaeological sense, but also in understanding the more recent and contemporary cultural and environmental significance of these landscapes. And so we're going to be sort of tackling it really from all of those different angles tonight as we move through various themes for discussion and highlight all of these different angles. So talking of all of these different angles, I'll now move on to introductions. So on the list, as in the programme, I'll go last and Nicki isn't in the room. So if we could have a very brief introduction from Dr. Tom Gardner, please, from Historic Environment Scotland.
Thanks very much for that, Gareth. Yeah, I'm Tom. I'm Ancient Monuments Officer with Historic Environment Scotland, but my training is as a soil scientist and a geoarchaeologist. Now, my engagement with peatlands and what I'll be talking about mostly within this theme is thinking about how we manage the historic environment of peatlands in the modern day. You know, we at Historic Environment Scotland do a lot of work on policy, engagement with land managers, engagement with the government, and peatlands, especially as we're starting to come to terms with climate change and how best to fight against it, are one of the front lines of that. And we need to be doing activities in these peatlands to help sequester carbon, stop them emitting CO2, all those sorts of things. But that brings us potentially into conflict with with buried archaeological deposits, with cultural heritage, with paleoecology. And so it's my job to kind of navigate that from a policy perspective. So you'll be hearing more from me about that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. And I have to say, as a complete novice to this, because I was drawn into this project as someone interested in things other than peatlands, I've been amazed by this aspect of peatlands. They're such complex things in terms of themselves, but also human interactions with them, aren't they? Just fascinating. Next on our panel, we've got Dr. Althea Davies from St Andrews University.
That's right. Thanks, Gareth. Yeah, I'm based in the School of Geography and Sustainable Development at St Andrews, and I'm interested in long-term human-environment interactions through paleoecology, and most of my work I've done in the UK uplands, where it's not just peatlands, it's also the drier end of it, so moorlands, but also woodlands, which are, all of them have different values to the communities who live there now, and it's also about, my interest is in finding out how they functioned, how they changed in the past, and importantly, how those past interactions with humans have left legacies that influence current management and conservation. And I'm also interested in doing research on environmental management, which is kind of brings together social and natural sciences. So some of that has been on things like upland management in the UK and Scotland, but also at the moment working with collaborators in Peru on Peruvian peatlands in the Amazon, where we're trying to understand more about the ecological value as well as the cultural value of peatlands in the tropics. So it's giving me a whole new slant on the way we study it here in Scotland.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating link. Thanks, Althea. That's brilliant. So I hope we can hear more about that later on. I think everyone will be very interested in hearing about the connections between those two places. I'll pass over now to our University College Cork colleagues. And could we hear from Rosie Everett first, please?
Oh, hello, everybody. So my name is Rosie Everett. I'm an environmental archaeologist, just finished a PhD on the topic. But more importantly, in the context of this event, I have been a research associate with Dr. Benjamin Gearey, working on the Wet Futures project, looking at different forms of public engagement with peatlands, particularly in Ireland, looking at the role of peatland rehabilitation and the way in which we can integrate the historic environment into the public engagement sector. That's me.
I'm sorry, Rosie, I should correct myself. You're at the University of Warwick.
Well, I'm kind of, well, I was split for a long time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It's and then our final speaker, apart from Nicki and myself then tonight, and also our keynote speakers tonight, can we have a short introduction from Ben Gearey, please?
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Ben Gearey. I'm based at University College Cork in Ireland. I won't say much now because I'm going to be talking more in a second, but I have a kind of broad range of interests in peatlands, ranging from archaeology through to paleoecology, through to policy and public engagement in different forms with peatlands. So that's something that I think we're going to touch on more shortly. So that's all I'll say for now.
Thanks, Ben. That's brilliant. So we don't have Nicki yet, and while we're doing introductions, and just for the sake of rounding out the full group of people who are going to be speaking tonight, so you can understand all of the different perspectives, I'll introduce both Nicki and myself unusually. So Nicki Whitehouse is senior lecturer in archaeological science at the University of Glasgow here, and her specialism is very much in peatlands, in the palaeoecology of peatlands, and she's an environmental archaeologist and looks at the socio-ecological dynamics of current and past populations in peatlands. But you'll hear a lot more from her later on about the specifics of what she does, and I'm afraid that I've misrepresented her badly there, but hopefully she'll undo some of that later on. And as a bit of an outsider, I'm Gareth Beale, I'm a lecturer in digital archaeology at the University of Glasgow. So not obviously linked to peatlands really, but my specialism is in archaeological representation and visualization. So my part in all of this is to think about how all of the work you're going to hear about tonight might be represented in experimental ways. So I was really drawn to all of the work that all of these experts that you're going to hear from tonight are doing, and thinking about how we can use digital techniques like immersive media and filmmaking and things like that to express this in different ways. So that's me. So without further ado then, I think we will move on to the next part of our evening, which is our keynote talk from Ben. So Ben, if I could pass over to you, do you have a presentation? Shall I allow you to share your screen over there?
If you could, Gareth, that would be fantastic. Whilst Gareth is facilitating that, yeah, as was just mentioned, we're all in the field at the moment. We're all scattered around a hotel somewhere in, where are we, Lincolnshire. So we were attempting to blur our background out because it looks like we're in some kind of a I don't know what, but hopefully Nicki will with us shortly as well. She's, yeah, we're having IT problems, which is again something we've heard of a lot over the last year or so. Okay, hopefully can everyone see that?
No.
Is it working?
Right.
I've just professed to be a specialist in digital technologies, but as you'll see, my grasp of these things is actually very limited.
Okay.
Here we go.
Can everyone see that?
Yeah, that's looking great, Ben. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so yeah, I mean, this has been called a keynote. I'm not sure that's probably quite right, but hopefully we're going to touch on some of the themes that have been referred to already. So Bright Edge Deep, Peatlands in History, Cultural Heritage and Climate. The title of this kind of short presentation is Peatland Generations. Myself and Rosie, you've already heard from. There's a number of other voices in this presentation that kind of will echo as we go through. Anyway, so Rosie's going to start us off here with a reading of, I'm sure everyone's recognised, many of you've recognised where the Bright Edge Deep comes from. So we're going to kick off with Rosie reading that piece. Rosie.
Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. My father, digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. The coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. By God, the old man could handle a spade, just like his old man. My father cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him a milk bottle in a bottle corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mould, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awakened in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Lovely, thank you, Rosie. Now, of course, it wouldn't really be a talk about peatlands without Seamus Heaney appearing. He's, of course, extremely illustrious literary figure when it comes to bog and representations of the bog. He's, of course, only one figure. And once one starts delving into the bog, it appears in all different forms of literary production, if you like, so poetry and art. And again, this is something that kind of lies behind, I suppose, the Bright Edge Deep project. An important thing to note, I think, is that Heaney tends to dominate many discussions of the representation of the bog, particularly in Ireland. There are many other more contemporary, more recent, writers, poets who are weaving and thinking of different ways of writing about the bog, and that includes the poet here, Anne-Marie Nicki, who some of you may be familiar with her collection of poetry, Bloodroot, which is wonderful, and again, it brings in different perspectives on landscape and the bog, and Anne-Marie will actually be recording for the later Bright Edge Deep website a reading of one of those poems. So, excuse me. So again, I think probably most of us are familiar. There's been a kind of blossoming, if that's the right word, of interest in peatlands in kind of all over the place, particularly many of these, I suppose, sometimes called new nature writing, which probably isn't a great expression or a great phrase, but some of you may be familiar with these books. So we've got the stories from the dark, the stories dark from stuff, the peatlands, whatever the phrase that's, stories from the dark stuff into the peatlands, a journey through the Mullen Year, Peat, Smoke and Spirit, and probably others. There's many other ones out there as well. And again, I think you find once you start, as I say, kind of delving into the peatlands and to peat, it's kind of everywhere. So that's, I suppose, something we want to touch on as part of Bright Edge Deep is these different, I suppose, the way the bog appears in these different kind of formulations and thoughts of landscape, and indeed how that relates to, I suppose, some of the issues around COP26 and climate change. Particularly, we look at Ireland, we have very different formulations of the bog. I mean, beginning really with colonial denigration of the Irish as bog trotters, of course, and so ranging from that very negative connotation through to, of course, Heaney's poems and other more recent poetry as well. So the bog is kind of almost everywhere in society and culture in Ireland in different ways. And again, it's not just in literature, it's in other forms of art as well. This is Shawn Lynch's reproduction, if that's the right word, of Joseph Boy's piece, Irish Energies, and that, as some of you may know, that's peat briquettes with Irish butter, and that was I think 2007, that piece. So again, once we start looking, the bog is kind of everywhere. And of course, for us as archaeologists, the bog is, as we've heard already, is extremely important in terms of what it preserves for us. Of course, the most obvious example of this would be bog bodies. So that's the Tolland man there, of course. I'm sure many of you will recognise his face. And again, it's these pictures that obviously influenced Heaney with his later cycle of bog poems. And again, you know, these kind of iconic writings. But again, in Irish peatlands.
Sorry to interrupt. So I think we've just got a white screen. We can't see your slide. I don't know if you want to stop screen sharing in there. Oh, no, that's fine now. Can everyone else see that? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
I don't know what happened there. Very strange. A glitch in the system. So yeah, so the Tolland man there, again, a picture many of you will recognise. And another image here, as many images we could show of marvellous organic archaeology from bogs in Ireland and the UK and Scotland as well. This is a Neolithic trackway from the site of Edacloon in County Longford, at the peatland site. So again, this marvellous preservation that we have in bogs of archaeology, and that's actually a site which is due to be published this year. A colleague, Kathy Moore, excavated that site, and that's going to be a publication that's due out very soon now. So again, this importance of the peatland as a record of, if you like, deep time. And that extends to something we've obviously heard touched on already in terms of the palaeoecological record. So the record of pollen grains and insect remains and plant remains that are preserved within peat, and that record that can help us understand or contextualize environmental change over millennial timescales. And again, this is particularly relevant in terms of when we talk about COP26, because of course bogs campus.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's gone back to a white screen again.
How's that?
That's the previous slide. It's still the roadway in Longford, and now it's white. Okay, now we can see it. Yeah.
I think there must be a delay in the system there. So can you see now the?
Can see baguette sandwich.
Okay.
I wonder if you come out.
So we'll just try launching this again. There's obviously some kind of weird delay.
Ben, it might just be the internet's really slow here and it's just struggling.
Sorry, everyone, talk amongst yourselves. Okay, what can we see now?
Ranging pole. And
there we go. That's the one. Oh, technology! How we've loved it over the last 18 months or so. So sorry, yes, the return. So yeah, peat as an expression of time slowed down or stopped, if you like, and the preservation of materials such as pollen grains, plant macrofossils, and insects, and these proxies that can tell us about climatic change as well. So I'm going to slow down a bit now, and hopefully the images will catch up as we go. So I've moved on now. Hopefully, in a minute that will catch up. Has that changed?
Yeah, that's good. Yep, we can see that.
Okay, very good. So which brings us on to, of course, the issue of the degradation and destruction of peatlands, of course. And there's various figures we can pull down in terms of the destruction and loss of peatlands through time. And particularly in Ireland, obviously the Midland bogs have been heavily extracted and denuded through peat cutting. Again, in the context of COP and climate change, as many of you will be aware, even though peatlands cover perhaps 3% of the Earth's surface, they account for an unusually large carbon store. And you get figures such as 550 gigatons of carbon in the peat. I mean, that's quite hard to visualize that. I think the importance here, of course, is the fact that peatlands in a healthy state at least store carbon. So they're important in terms of obviously biodiversity, water storage, the preservation of the archaeological record, as we've just seen. So we have this intersection, this kind of merging of themes within peatlands that I think is what in part makes them such a rich source of inspiration, if you like. In terms of figures of land area, so for example, Ireland and Scotland, about 20%-ish of the land area of those two countries are peatland of one form or other. I think the figure is closer to 10% in the UK. And if you go to the IUCN peatlands programme, they tell us perhaps only 20% of the UK area of peatlands is in what we might call near pristine condition. So peatlands everywhere are threatened, have been destroyed, or not in good states, basically. Okay, so I've just moved on again there. Hopefully we can see that.
Yeah, that's white again, actually. I think maybe just try flicking backwards and forwards. Okay, we can see that now, but that's the photo from before of someone in field.
Yes. Okay, I think we just got internet issues. So what cause for optimism do we have? And now, particularly over the last 30 years or so, we've kind of seen a shift in the way we perceive bogs, and in particular in Ireland in the last, I suppose, 10 to 15 years, we've had a real surge of appreciation of the value of peatlands, particularly restored peatlands. So these are two shots of Abbey Leaks bog. Abbey Leaks are part of the Community Wetlands Forum, who are a network of community groups in Ireland who are extremely active in terms of bog restoration and advocating for such. So we can have a real kind of contrast between the cut over dry bog surface and the restored bog surface, and the bog that is functioning, if you like, in the way that it should do in terms of sequestering carbon, but also obviously the cultural and social importance of the bog as well in that sense. So again, moving on, hopefully you can see a picture of myself and Rosie there.
No.
Now?
Yes.
No, right, okay. I seem to have got the thing here. We have to go forwards and backwards. Okay, so the title of this talk was peatland generations. I think we can think of bogs as being generational, kind of both literally and metaphorically. So again, for us archaeologists, we have bogs as, if you like, records of deep time, of records stretching back multiple generations. But we can kind of think, I suppose, more literally. So several weeks ago, this is 3 weeks ago, I think, myself and Rosie were out in the bogs, some bogs in Ireland. We went to Drumming Bog, and then we were up in West Cavan working with one of the community groups up there. As part of that, this is the site of Fortran Bog. Hopefully that's come up now. There's some other people on the bog. Hopefully.
Now we've got a photo of you and Rosie, actually. I'm sorry.
Try that again. Does that come up?
Not yet.
Try come out. Sorry, everyone. We'll try coming out and going in again.
Oh, here we go. Yes, we can see that now. Yeah. Okay.
So yes, we were up in Cavan with the West Cavan Bogs group, who again are extremely active in terms of advocating for peatland restoration, but also the importance of peatlands as, I suppose, an integral component of the community landscape. So the picture you're seeing here, this is the gentleman in the middle, the elderly gentleman, that is Aidan. So Aidan, the strip of peatland you can see, or the area of peatland you can see behind him here, this is the area of bog that he cut as a young man and later as a farmer. You also see there his wife, Bridie, on the left, his son, Ronan, on the left-hand side there again, his nephew Jim, and his granddaughter Nisha. So we have several generations of this family, and we can kind of trace through these generational connections, I suppose, the broader changing relationship that we've had with the bogs more broadly. So if we go back to Aidan when he was a young man, he was born in 1934. So in those days, he would have been cutting peat on this bog, particularly during the period of World War II. It's known as the emergency in Ireland. So we see in that formulation, peat as resource, so peat as a fossil fuel, essential for warming people's homes. And of course, this is not long after the foundation of the Irish Free State. So again, the importance of the bog as a resource that granted, if you like, energy independence to a young state. As we move on, so as we move on through the lens of Aidan, even as far as 1955, we still see peatlands being represented as, in the words of Fraser Darling, the English ecologist, particularly talking about Scottish upland peatlands he described as wet deserts. So again, we see this formulation of peatlands as really as landscapes of little other than our source of. Oh, some strange noise in the background there. Oh. Hopefully you can still hear me. We had some strange breakup noises there. It's not until 1980 that the importance of peatland conservation began to be realised in Ireland. 1996, and the Ramsar Convention, who referred in that year to the importance of the conservation of peatlands, recognising peatlands as important wetland types hitherto underrepresented in the work of the convention. And the recommendation at that time pointed to the ongoing degradation and destruction of peatland systems in many areas of the world due to agriculture and urban development, forestry, energy development, and horticultural harvesting of peat. Called on contracting parties to maintain or give priority to the inventory and evaluation of peatlands and to nominate additional peatland ecosystems as Ramsar sites. And that brings us later on to the COP. And again, this begins to tie us back to COP26. So it was in 1999 that COP started to, the community of parties started to pay some attention to peatlands. In 1999, the next draft global action plan, we see the first Ramsar decision to acknowledge the importance of peatlands for climate change mitigation and underline the need to include all wetland carbon sinks and sequestration initiatives as key issues in the global discussion concerning the Kyoto Protocol and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that brings us into the 2000s, and that brings us our timeline and our generations up to Aidan's son and nephew. And they both describe cutting the bog in the early 2000s, mainly for the crack. So mainly for the social side of peat cutting. And it's really not until 2010 that we see the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that starts to look at the importance of activities associated with rewetting and restoration of wetlands as contributions to national actions on mitigation of climate change. In 2011, we have Achim Steiner, who was at that point the Director General of the United Nations Environment Programme, who described peatland restoration as a low-hanging fruit and amongst the most cost-effective options for mitigating climate change. So perhaps we are moving from, I suppose, what we might call the crisis, the degradation, the cutting of peat, to perhaps an era of some new optimism about restoration of peatlands, not only in terms of climate change, the critical battle against climate change, but also the deep social and cultural importance of peatlands as well. So to close our timeline there, we have Nisha, Aidan's granddaughter there. We're brought up to date with the realisation of the key role and importance of peatlands in terms of these issues. What happens next to bogs, I suppose, is critical not only for Nisha's generations, but for many generations to come. I'm going to finish at that point. What is Bright Edge Deep? I suppose we can close. What it's about, in many ways, it's an avowedly personal reflection on culture, science, art, and politics of peat and peatlands. It's about thinking how we can bring disciplines together to illuminate the importance of peatlands beyond biodiversity and ecological function, and to consider how we can perhaps create new lively ecologies and different ways of knowing into COP26. It's about showing how the arts, science and humanities can and need to work together. None of our disciplines can stand on their own. It's not about any simplistic, it's not about any attempt to present simplistic narratives or just say stories, or indeed claims to authoritative interpretations of the meaning of peatlands, art, artists, or literature. I think it is about exploring disciplinary permeability and connections, perhaps Heaney's living roots, but moving away from what we might call arborescent formations of knowledge. Everything is entangled if you're willing to follow the subterranean rhizomes. And I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. That's brilliant. And there are so many points in there that I'm sure will come up in the discussion for the rest of the evening, but a brilliant start to things. So thank you very much. And got some lovely little clapping emojis there for you. One for Beale. So before we move on to the next part of the evening, which is going to be led by Rosie, I will just quickly pass over for a quick introduction. Nicki has managed to resolve her internet issues and is here now, so she can make up for the terrible job that I did earlier on of trying to introduce her in her absence.
Thank you very much, Gareth. I'm not going to say very much, but thank you everybody for joining us. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here at the start. Myself, Rosie and Ben are all staying in the same hotel, and we're all having the same internet issues, except in my room. I don't get any internet at all, so I'm in one of my colleagues' rooms. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you're going to enjoy some of the discussions. And thank you to Ben, especially for kicking things off. And I don't know if Gareth has mentioned that this is the first of several events that we're organising as part of the Bright Edge Deep. The online exhibition will hopefully be ready. We're hoping by something like the 16th of September. We're really busy gathering all the information and imagery and accounts to go with that. And there's going to also be some other online talks in September and October, and a further roundtable meeting in November. So this is just start really, and hope you enjoy it, and we have some good discussions. So I'm just going to leave it there and pass over to Rosie.
Hi everybody. Can everyone see and hear me? Is that?
Yes, it's
brilliant.
It's clear. It's fine.
So thanks, Ben. I don't really know how to follow with that. That's great. So our first sort of discussion point for this evening is about peatlands through history, which is quite a broad brush discussion point, considering just the different disciplines that are not just within the panel on this this event, but actually, you know, the number of people just scanning through who's in the audience at the moment. The idea of peatlands in history is very broad brush, but actually going back to what Ben was talking about the different forms of peat across the UK and Ireland and into Europe and beyond, what we sort of wanted to talk about is the different strings attached to peatlands that form this notion of peatland history, so the cultural and the economic and the archaeological to the ecological, and how we can use all those different entanglements to talk about some different aspects. So, you know, what is it that makes a peatland? What are those distinct traits that we can identify across those different entanglements that say this is a peatland? You know, how do those peatlands function? And then, you know, from the archaeological perspective, how do we get that human interface and interaction with peatlands through time, and how that's changed, not just in the archaeological record, but from a historical perspective. And finally, you know, why do humans interact with peatlands? What is it about them that makes us, you know, for example, deposit bog bodies, or use them for turf cutting, or as we're sat here today, and there are many, as I can see in the audience, different artists and people who deal with not just archaeological records, but why is it inspired so many pieces of artwork and literature over the last several hundred years. So that is, in a very, very quick, broad brush sense, what this discussion theme is about. I will be leading, but I know that Ben and Gareth and Nicki and Althea and Tom will also be contributing to this discussion. So where should we start? Should we start with, what is it that makes a peatland? I think that's probably, for a peatland discussion, that might be a good place to start from the beginning, defining what it is within your discipline that distinguishes peatlands from other environments. I'll just open that up.
Perhaps we can qualify that by asking the question that many of the peatlands, as I referred to earlier, many peatlands, excuse me, in the UK and further afield have been impacted in different ways. We have very few what we might call pristine peatlands. In particular, as we shift to restoration of peatlands, the restored ecosystems, or the systems in different stages of recovery, are strictly, in many ways, not in a narrow definition of peatlands. So how do we think, in other words, to put this another way, how do we think about peatlands as, I suppose, novel ecological systems, as these systems are recovering, if you like? So as we re-wet, cut over bogs, what we end up with, of course, is these are re-wetted bog surfaces. How do we think about those systems? I suppose is something I might throw out there, if that question makes sense. Because pretty much every, I mean, again, this is a broader question about, how we think about nature and culture. Almost pretty much every ecosystem on Earth is impacted in one way or another. So to talk about kind of wild nature is, in many ways, in many people's eyes, perhaps not that useful. So I'm rolling a few themes out there, perhaps maybe to try and get some ideas rolling. I think really any comments at this stage arising from anything we said about peatlands and how people think about peatlands would be quite handy, perhaps.
Yeah.
Can I make a couple of comments with regard to the first question that was raised about the distinctiveness, the distinct traits that make a peatland? So I guess from my perspective, a lot of what makes a peatland distinctive is actually to do with its ecological characteristics. Of course, the sort of hydrological aspects, but for me, a lot of it is about the dominance of different types of plants, but particularly in terms of other communities, invertebrates is what I particularly wanted to highlight. Limited in some way, not biodivergent with these particular habitats. Ecosystem with the invertebrate community, and I think, to me, that's what makes peatlands really distinctive, because you get these different species which are only found in peatlands, and which are specialised to peatlands. Not only that, you also get them in the fossil record, and in many cases, the species which are distinctive in those peatland systems have been around for thousands of years. So you're essentially getting the origins of these peatlands going back, 3,000-4,000 years, and they continue right the way through time. And that, to me, seems incredible, that you have a system today which essentially has its origins 4,000 years ago. And that's what we can tell, certainly from the invertebrate aspects. So I'm just going to shut up there, but that's my contribution to the traits.
No, I think that's a really, I think it's a really good place to start, because particularly from the sort of traditional paleoecological perspective, it's that joy of when you put your core in for the first time and you pull it up on a peatland, and you get those different environments just in your stratigraphy without even, you know, taking those back to the lab. So even though you already know you're on a bog because you're stood on it and you're coring through it, actually being able to see those different phases of the bog and the development of the bog kind of sets the scene before we even start unpicking what that means in terms of a human landscape, how people interact in those environments. So yeah, absolutely, I think it's a great place to start.
Rosie, can I just jump in here? I think there's a very interesting, so a lot of my colleagues here are academics, and I think Ben's keynote gave a very broad and I think exceptionally accurate description of what peatlands actually are and their importance. It's very interesting that on the policy side of things, we actually have a very small, short, precise description of what a peatland is, and that's what we consider it to be. And in Scotland, it's any sediment or any soil with an organic component of greater than 60% that is more than 50 centimeters deep. That is a peatland. It can also, I suppose, be wetlands, and that depends upon surface vegetation, but it's a really quite limited description. But it has to be limited so that when we are organising grant giving for peatland restoration, we have a very tight description that we know to match, because we have to fund peatland restoration. We can't fund other things with this pot of Scottish Government money. And so while Nicki's description is exceptionally broad and I think a lot more accurate than ours in the policy side of things, the description of what actually makes a peatland changes depending upon what you need to do with that information. And from the policy perspective, we have a very, very tight description in Scotland. I think in England, it's different as well. In England, I think the definition of peatlands, or certainly the grant funding thresholds. I know Kat Hopwood's here and may be able to speak about this in more detail in some of the questions, but I think they go down to 30 centimeters depth or something like that is a peatland in England that would be viable for funding for restoration. So there are some thresholds being imposed in policy that don't quite mesh with the paleoecological understanding or the ecological understanding of what a peatland is. It's just an interesting point to put out there, but I'll stop talking about that.
No, I think that's a really interesting interface between the realism of enacting policy and what we'd all like to spend our time sort of looking at in terms of peatlands. I think, there is that need for that strict definition, in terms of the policy and, making sure that the right funding goes into the right place and the right policy is guided. But we are running a little bit over time. So we've only got sort of 10 minutes before the next discussion needs to kick off. Is that right? Yeah, that is right, isn't it, Gareth? So we should probably move on a bit in terms of defining peatlands, but going back to sort of the second and third points of discussion about that human interaction and why humans interact with peatlands, and how we can discern past, present and potentially future interactions with peatlands on a societal or even on an individual level. So yeah, if anyone has...
I wonder whether it'd be worth asking people in the audience. I mean, one of the good things about Zoom is people don't want to speak, they don't have to, but if people want to comment into the comment thread, I think it might be a time to ask people to perhaps add their thoughts about any of these questions, this one in particular, in terms of how people perhaps perceive peatlands, and whether people in the audience, for example, how many people in the audience who are listening have a local peatland, for example, how many people are active in terms of I suppose bog restoration. I know there's some artists in the audience as well who draw inspiration from peatlands as well. So it might be nice to kind of get information perhaps through the thread if people don't want to speak. But again, I think if anyone has got anything they want to say in particular, I mean, not just about these themes, I think this is a starting point. Please, feel free to put your hand up. I think that would be quite good as well.
We have an audience member. We have a Henry Chapman. If you would like to speak, Henry.
Oh no, thank you. No, the discussion just reminded me actually of today. I'm in the field. But actually, there was a conversation earlier on actually about the connected nature of people, people who live in an area and the beaches. And part of the conversation was actually about place names. And actually, so how do you refer to things? How many people then, very local people actually know particular place names associated with the peatlands. But as you go further afield, the discussion was actually how connected are people to these landscapes to begin with, even before you start thinking about that question about how they're used or how they could be used. And I just think this almost, it goes back to the first discussion point where just thinking about, well, how much do people understand what's actually beneath them? Yeah, so it's a comment really rather than or an observation.
No, I think that's quite a critical observation, because actually Ben and I had a similar experience when we went over in Ireland last month. Sue, I've seen your message. I'll just quickly make my little comment. We were dealing with a bog down in the south that was very isolated. So in terms of actually community engagement with the bog, it was very minimal because people didn't know it was there. It was like surrounded by woodland, and the only people that knew it was there were the local forum who would pump money in to make sure that it was restored and put back into the community. But actually one of the difficult conversations was, how do we get it back into the community when nobody knows it's there? So we've got these grandiose ideas that everybody should connect to the bog, but if nobody can access it, then how do you get that link back to the community? So it is a difficult one. Thanks, Henry. So Sue says, one of the aspects of peatlands that interests me is that, like other areas of common land, they were shared resources that required negotiations with your neighbours, and when drained and closed, people were often disenfranchised. There are some local community groups looking to reclaim peat, i.e. access. Yeah, exactly. I mean, my experiences with an island, and we can see that coming through. We can see those conversations between not just landowners but community groups and those who've got vested interests, and it is almost like reclaiming it as a community space rather than just about being a bit of land. So yeah, I don't think to add to that.
I think we've got a hand up from Nicki. Is that current, Nicki?
Yes, I was going to make a comment about this as well. We've found exactly the same experience through Project Wildscape, where essentially most people, local people in the vicinity, know nothing about the raised mires in the vicinity. They find them wilderness places that are alien to them. And yet historically, these were hugely important areas where people obtained a whole range of resources, from fishing to fowling to peat cutting, through to other traditional crafts, and of course wetland grazing as well. But all of that was lost with the drainage of the landscape in the 17th century, and consequently people became fairly disconnected from these places. But not only that, we as a country, I think, have largely forgotten about what it might have been like to live in these places. Something like 25% of the UK used to be covered by peatlands, and those activities have largely been lost, and we don't really associate with those anymore. But when we think about sort of nature conservation in these places at the moment, because people are disenfranchised, they always see the restoration of these landscapes as being essentially somebody else's problem. And you get vandalism issues and things like that. But until we can get local communities to re-engage with these places, there'll be no ownership given to them. And consequently, it's always somebody else's problem to restore these places. And so this disconnection creates major issues at a ground level in terms of conservation, but also in terms of flood management and so on. So it's really important.
No, exactly. Sorry, we've got 3 minutes left, and we've just got some fantastic comments coming through on the chat. So Michael Given, thank you. He says, so in terms of human engagement with the peat in the past, it's not just about the peat/turf, but dye for plants, the fruits that are available, like blueberries, medicinal herbs, experiences and memories. That's it's such a fantastic comment, and I think that's kind of what we were trying to capture with the Bright Edge Deep project, trying to look beyond just turf as is, trying to talk about some of those more entangle sort of cultural aspects of peat. So thank you very much. Oh, we've got a few more comments coming through. Have we got time? So Kat Hopwood Lewis, thank you. There's a definite difference between how we might define peat for grant giving purposes or as archaeologists or ecologists, and the visceral experience of a bog as squishy, wobbly, and the sound of a bog. Now this is actually as peatland restoration kind of comes into the forefront, and artistic practitioners are kind of engaging with this element of the bog. This is exactly what's going on. There's been some fantastic pieces to come out over the last sort of 10-20 years. One of my favorite concept videos out in Ireland was of a man falling into a bog, and it was recorded, and it was all about sort of the sounds that it made as he hit the wet turf. And there was something very poignant about this sort of motion of a human falling into a bog and the sounds that it created. So yeah, absolutely, it goes beyond sort of just like the vegetation. Sorry, sorry, we've got 1 minute left. I'm trying to get through all the comments.
Getting some good comments coming in here. So we're just sorry, not trying to miss anyone else out here.
The last
we got one from Kate Foster from seeing the Scottish Forestry Group blog posts recently. I think Scottish forestry regulations are nominating 10 centimetres peatland. Not quite sure of the exact designations, but it all seems quite arbitrary. Yes, I think it is. And this is often the problem with peatland definitions anyway, as we've heard, basically. So let's just move down a bit. This really matters, for example, where with tree plantation can happen. With other artists, Maura Patterson and Ted Leeming explored this in an event, Splot and Splat, hosted by UK Repeat Anthology, in a way of talking about changing land use in relatively remote areas. That sounds very interesting. How long are we doing for time? We're just
we're out.
We're actually just squeeze a quick one more, maybe very quickly. This is from Taya. I think the naming may be an important disconnect between peatland and the public, not just the area named, but what do we call a peatland linguistically?
Absolutely.
Yeah, many people mentioned bogs, marshes, mares, etc. in this discussion already. Many names that people know what many of these will be peatland. Is there a jargon problem? Yes, yeah, I think there is. There's the short answer there.
And it goes beyond just sort of jargon. It's like there's Irish, for example, in Irish peatlands, there's an Irish linguist, Michael McGann, who talks about all the different words for all the different types of peat, when you're essentially talking about the same environment, but all of them have different cultural affiliations, and it gets quite complicated. So absolutely. And thank you. Last one, sorry, Angus, thank you. And yes, don't forget about the industrial exploitation. Absolutely.
It's important. There's the ecological one. Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point.
So thank you very much, everybody. That was great. Sorry.
Thank you very much for that impressive feat of managing multiple streams and conversations simultaneously. I think you've always got another career on Radio 4 if you need it. that's right, yes. So I think that leads on really nicely, actually, because we sort of ended up with these points about the idea of peatlands and the fact that peatlands are these very culturally dependent sorts of landscapes, possibly without clear definitions and without clear edges. And I think that takes us very nicely into the next part of the evening, which is going to be led by Althea, which is all about peatlands and cultural heritage. So we're going to move the discussion on slightly to think explicitly about how peatland relates to ideas in cultural heritage and cultural heritage management. Althea, are you here? Hello. Hi. So are you happy to lead us through the next part of the discussion then, please, Althea?
Yeah, ready. With some notes so I don't forget some things. So hopefully I'll do as good a job as Rosie as keeping an eye on comments too. So as part of the sort of run up with the formation of the Bright Edge Deep, I had some really interesting conversations with Kate Foster, who's here at the meeting and has raised comments about whose culture and whose heritage peatlands are associated with. And we've just heard the discussion move, very rapidly onto the ideas of different cultural values and perceptions of peatlands. And I think that's why they're sometimes called the sort of Cinderella ecosystem, because there's this ambivalence and this invisibility of some of the things that we as paleoecologists, environmental archaeologists are interested in to do with peatlands. So I think we've sort of set 3 questions to sort of focus this discussion about peatland and cultural heritage around. And I think we've already moved quite well on to the first of those, which is what is distinctive about peatland cultural heritage. Ben has already given us an insight into some of the recent, contemporary and the prehistoric aspect of heritage that we get preserved within the peatland records. And it's these wetland waterlogged records that are so central to the work of many of us as well. So Ben, you've already given us bog bodies, trackways. Nicki's mentioned insects. Anything else our experts would like to bring to the table as things that are of key importance in the archive that peatlands preserve? Because to me, that's a fundamental part of peatland heritage. And I think it's one of those difficult things that it's partly cultural, because we in our disciplines have a culture of valuing the palaeoecological and archaeological record, and cultural aspects of ecosystems are recognized as very hard to put a value on and bring into economic and policy discussions, which is why we heard from Tom that there's that very specific definition of peat. So what else would our experts like to say, really ought to be part of this discussion about why peatland heritage matters, why we should value it?
So Althea, I've got an eye on the participants list here, and we had a hand up from Tom, and then we've got a hand up from Nicki.
Okay, Tom first then maybe?
Fantastic, thank you. I'm just going to keep my video off just because I think my connection is slightly unstable, so apologies for that, but hope you can all hear me. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the Scottish peatlands is that I think we need to remember that peatlands have not always been in the places that they currently are. And peatlands have grown in places. So, for example, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, we have a lot of sub-peat landscapes that are Neolithic and Bronze Age. There are Bronze Age and Neolithic landscapes which have been subsumed by peat over time. Non-peat landscapes lying beneath peat, preserved, intact, and often minerogenic, and then covered by peat. So while we often think about the things that are preserved in the peat, I think we should also think about things that are buried under the peat, and how they're buried, the fact that they're buried by peat influences how we are able to study them, because we can't see them from the air, for example, as easily as we would otherwise do. So I think sub-peat landscapes would be a big one for me.
Okay, thank you. Nicki?
Okay, so for me, it would probably be some of the climate records that we can obtain from the peat itself, either from the plant macro remains or the peat in its various forms. Also things like bog oak records, so we very frequently get pine and oak preserved in these peatlands, which can be dated, but they also provide a really nice climate record. And then other things which might be slightly less visible, things like the carbon and other sort of stable isotope records associated with some of the animals and plants that we get preserved, but also thinking about understanding the former record of peatlands and thinking about what that might tell us about the former extent, as in volume, of peatlands that would have been around in the past, and what that implies around the loss of carbon, for instance, as that material has degraded or it's been removed. So, historically, we might know that an area had up to 8 to 10 meters of peat, and thinking about what that might actually mean in terms of carbon loss and so on. So those are some of the things that I think are quite important.
Yeah, which brings us very strongly onto the sort of COP theme as well. And we had the quite alarming IPCC report that came out yesterday, talking about the limited time we have to change our practices, our habits, our policy. And although peatlands and peatland contributions like the ones Nicki has just mentioned don't really get too much publicity, they're an important part of what goes into these climate models to make sure that we can understand how climate records work, how we can understand long-term climate change, and make sure, because it's all that knowledge about how the climate system works on long timescales that allows us to have more confidence that they can predict change into the future. So peatlands are one of many important sources that contribute to that. We've also had a comment I see about rock art that could be dated, and I know one of the areas that is peatland has been used to try and contribute to understanding it, if not the date, at least the environment in which some rock art was constructed. So I know in parts of Kilmartin on the west coast of Scotland, we've certainly tried to find bits of peat bog that were very close to sites of rock art to try and understand something of the environment at the time. So yeah, very strong potential connections between the archaeology and the peatland record, which obviously Tom has also mentioned with these sub-peat landscapes that we can, through various difficult ways, maybe trying to detect below peatlands. I guess one of the things about peatland heritage is that often it's only exposed in the process of destroying or damaging or eroding of peatlands. So one of the questions that we set ourselves to talk about in this session was thinking about some of the practical and policy challenges for jointly managing peatlands for carbon, but also for cultural heritage. So I wondered if maybe Ben and Rosie, I know you've had close involvement, and Ben, you've written about some of these issues before. So where are we with trying to manage peatlands for carbon and as archives for archaeology and cultural heritage?
It's a very good and pertinent question. Where should we start? We could probably work backwards from perhaps some of the more optimistic side of things, which peatland archaeology, given the kind of enormous loss of archaeological sites from peatlands, particularly in Ireland. Perhaps more positively, we have Historic Scotland, Tom and his team, who are, I think, in many ways kind of leading the way in terms of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales in terms of kind of proactive policies to, I suppose, marry up restoration programmes with the historic environment for mutual benefit, I guess.
But that's also happening in the UK, in England. So I can see that Zoe Hazel is in the audience as well, and she's worked tirelessly with within Historic England and exchanging out with DEFRA, the UK, the English Department for Department of Rural and
Farm and Rural Affairs. So yeah, so DEFRA's recent policy statement on this, which came out 2 months ago, was it?
Yeah, it's something that we've been working on with Zoe and other colleagues over the last sort of 18 months, and it's a real positive shift. Given the, I don't want to be political, but given the current government having that in place as a piece of proactive policy, and to have the historic environment included in that has been a real push forward. And I know that Zoe, if I'm speaking on your behalf, I do apologise, but I know that's something that you guys have worked really hard and very proud of. So it's the fact that it's written into policy it's a start. It's there. It's not just it's archaeology, like it's
I think the shorter message there is archaeology is often a drop ball when it comes to restoration programs. It tends to be regarded as someone else's problem. Certainly with DEFRA's and Natural England now have a policy statement on this as well. So this should amount to hopefully positive benefit in terms of restoration of peatlands, not just for biodiversity and that kind of end of ecosystem services, but cultural heritage is a key part of that. And So yeah, I mean, that's, sorry that we've gone on a bit there, but that's probably reasons. If we're more positive, I think that's what we would say at this stage. The situation in Ireland is significantly different. I'll say nothing more about that at the current time.
It's probably the negative end of it, where we are still sort of banging on people's doors and drumming, banging the drum as loud as we can about the impacts of not just peat cutting for archaeological preservation, but also the way in which you go about rehabilitation. It's not just about chucking water onto a bog. You have to actually consider what it is that you're trying to restore and how that will impact archaeology. So there are still some difficult conversations to be had.
That's interesting to hear, because it's actually related to that I was wondering if maybe Tom can say something, because I noticed that on the Nature Scot website, it, as part of their guidance for peatland action, their restoration advice, they say that peat dams should be constructed as the default technique for blocking drains. And that to me is like, well, a few weeks ago, I was up in the Cairngorm sampling a site where we know that lots of it is going to be destroyed in order to try and create these peat dams to stop erosion. So that is going to destroy the peat stratigraphy in the archive that I value in order to try and preserve what's left of the bog. Tom, is that an issue that's being recognised and dealt with?
Yeah, it is, and it's an issue, and it's hard for us to deal with. I mean, I suppose we'll talk about this in the kind of third theme that we'll be looking at, but the way that we're starting to think about things in Scotland, and I know that colleagues who are represented here in from Historic England and Natural England, and also colleagues in CADU in the Northern Irish government, are thinking along similar lines. And in some stages, it was very kind of Ben to say that Scotland's far ahead on this. We're further ahead than we were. I think we have a lot to learn from lots of other parts of the United Kingdom. And let's not forget that this is a global issue. There are individuals working on this all across the world. Peatlands are not restricted to the UK and Ireland, and so we have a lot to learn from colleagues in other countries as well as to how to mitigate the impacts on cultural heritage within peatland restoration. To go specifically to peat dams, yeah, I mean, peat dams are often used, and they have a relatively large footprint as a form of as a peatland restoration process. For those who don't know about peatland restoration, what you're generally trying to do is re-wet the bog because the bog has gotten a bit dry or its hydrology is oscillating, and that's causing the peat to dry out and deflate and then erode essentially and emit carbon dioxide. That sequestered carbon becomes carbon dioxide. So what you're trying to do is raise the water table, and one of the ways you can do that is to dam up gullies and ditches that have already been excavated with peat. But as Althea's pointed out, that can that causes a physical impact upon those those paleoecological deposits and potentially any archaeological deposits within them. It's a difficult thing for us to manage because up until now we don't really know where it's happening either, Althea. We don't know where these dams have been put in. One of the big processes we're putting in place with Peatland Action, and they've been fantastic at working with us, is increasing the resolution of the mapping. So if a peatland restoration project is happening, we now get good grid coordinates on where a peat dam has been put in so that we can get these published, and then you don't go out in the field next year and put a core through a peat dam that you've not noticed and have a pollen sequence that's totally nonsense, because that would waste your time and public money and the money of whoever's funding you. So we're trying to do these things to help make the process a little bit easier. Going back to the kind of original question, which I think was what are the main practical and policy challenges for jointly managing peatlands and as carbon stores and as cultural heritage, I think one of the big problems is information sharing. As I've pointed out, loads of people are working on this all over the world. Loads of people have got lots of different ways of restoring peatlands. I think Peatland Action have identified 42 different methods to date of restoring peatlands, different techniques that they use, subsurface bunding, ditch blocking, all these different types of things, which all have potential impacts upon archaeology. And other countries and other practitioners will have different ways of doing things, and will also have different archaeological records and different cultural heritage associations with their peatlands. The big problem for us is information sharing. We don't get a lot of information from other countries about this, and we're trying desperately and working alongside people like Zoe Hazel at Historic England to do more of this sharing and problem solve and see if we've got any quick troubleshooting that we can do as a group so we can help get around these issues. I noticed that Rosie's got her hand up, her physical hand up.
I'm so sorry, I can't figure out how to do the whole raise your hand.
So is Nicki, I think.
I can't figure it out. No, I just wanted to, it was a very, very quick comment. I don't want to interject on all the fab comments that are coming through. So Ben and I know a few people in the audience as well, are part of the Global Peatlands Initiative, which is a UN environmental environment program initiative, and they're trying at the moment to consolidate what you're talking about, Tom, not just how to restore peatlands, but also all the different groups and disciplines that are working, you know, across the globe on all of these different issues within restoring peatlands in line with the UN's global target, global emissions targets. So there are tractions at the moment for getting a unified approach, but it, you know, when you're trying to do it on a global scale, it is difficult. But that's all I wanted to say. So.
Nicki, and then if you make your point, and then I'll try and cover some of the comments that are being raised to end this theme.
Yeah, just to pick up on this issue of increasing water tables on sites and how it might impact the archaeological record, it's also quite important to point out that raising water tables also has an impact on the ability of peatland to either absorb carbon or to release carbon. So if you have a peatland, particularly lowland peatland, which has got too much inundation, in fact, you get an increase of methane production, and that is also impacting the amount of impacts generally in terms of the carbon cycle. If, on the other hand, you manage to maintain your water table, that means that the carbon that is already sequestered within peatlands doesn't become a net contributor. But for instance, at the moment, something like 11 out of 15 lowland peatlands are net carbon inputs to the atmosphere, and they're not sequestering any carbon. So essentially they're not doing the job that they need to do, and that's really down to water level management. But if the water levels are increased too much, then they also produce too much methane. So there's quite a very delicate balance to be achieved there.
Yeah, and a lot of monitoring and communications needed between teams with different interests, which is, I think, some of the good points that Michael Strategus and Rose Ferraby have raised in the comments. You know, Michael asks, what is the connection like between ecological restorers and archaeological mitigation? Are there connections? And then Rose commented that in the peatland partnership in the southwest, Rose, I'm not sure if that's in Scotland or somewhere else, mentions that they have a designated archaeologist on their team. So that's something that could help that process of connections and getting better exchanges, so we're more aware of those interests. You know, as Nicki said, it's a very difficult balance to manage. And then Michael Given has mentioned something that Kate Foster also drew to my attention recently on Lewis, the linguistic diversity of terms used to refer to these peatland landscapes. And yeah, how some communities are using them to try and re-engage people with their peatlands. Oh, thank you, Rose in the southwest of England. So I think maybe to allow us a very short comfort break, maybe we'll stop. Gareth, should we stop there for a few minutes before going on to the next theme?
Sorry, I was still muted. Yes, yes. Let's wrap up now and then restart at past, if that's okay with everyone. So we'll come back at 7:30 to start the final discussion point. Hello, everyone. Hopefully everyone is back from their comfort break and ready to start the last part of the event tonight. So we've got half an hour now, and we're going to have one more discussion theme led by Tom, and this is going to be explicitly on the issue of peatlands and climate, which is something we've touched on at other points in the session today, but we're really going to dive into that a bit more deeply now. And I'm sure this is an issue that a lot of you have an interest in. So we'll have a bit of time for discussion about that afterwards as well. So make sure that you add your questions to the chat box, or towards the end we'll put your hand up and we'll invite you to come forwards and read your questions out loud. So Tom, I'll pass over to you now then for this part.
Great, thanks for that, Gareth. Yes, I mean, we've already covered some of this before, but I think it's a really, I think this question around, peatlands and climate is the reason we're having this conversation now. As Ben outlined in his keynote, peatland restoration and peatland kind of renewal is a relatively new thing. Peatlands have been being harvested and used by humans, not all with the leading to degradation, but quite often leading to degradation for a very long time. It's since prehistory, and it's only in 2010 that Ramsar actually identified that peatlands were an area that needed to be looked at for restoration. And as Ben also pointed out, they identified peatland restoration as one of the low-hanging fruit of the fight against climate change. We wouldn't be having this conversation today because there wouldn't be the kind of policy drive and the drive and intensity on kind of that myopic focus on peatland restorations that we're getting from COP if we hadn't recognized this. So this is a relatively new fight that we're all fighting, and it's fantastic to get the number of people we've got around the table and to talk about this. I'm going to quickly rattle off some quite troubling facts about global peatlands and how they're doing, because shocker, they're not doing well. But that is the kind of the reason why we're in this predicament and the reason that we're having this conversation. So, I mean, Ben's already outlined some of this. Peatlands cover 3% of the global landmass, but they are 35% of the world's terrestrial carbon store. So they hold a lot of carbon, and all that carbon has been sequestered by the vegetation growing on the top of the peatland over time. 15% of global peatlands have been drained. Actually, not that high a number as you would think, but it's still a huge area of peatlands, so they've been drained. Globally, peatlands are a net carbon emitter and emit 1.3 gigatons of carbon dioxide every year. That's a nonsense number. I don't know what that means, but it sure sounds like a lot. To put that into a better context, that's 5.6% of all of the global anthropogenic CO2 emissions. So 5.6% of global CO2 emissions coming from human activity are coming from peatlands that are degrading. And the principal way in which we've damaged our peatlands has been through agriculture, drainage for agriculture. If you look at the United Kingdom, and I'm afraid I've only really got the stats for for the United Kingdom, so for Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland here. I've not got the Irish stats. The picture is quite a lot worse here than it is globally. We live in a very intensively used landscape. I think something like 80% or 85% of UK peatlands have been damaged and are considered to be in a degraded state. Again, UK peatlands are a net emitter of carbon. It's really quite troubling, and our peatlands are also quite extensive. For example, in Scotland, peatlands cover 24% of Scotland's landmass. And it's, again, as Ben's pointed out, similar in Ireland, and the kind of sum UK total is about 10% of landmass. So this is a huge area of land, and it's emitting carbon dioxide. And it's not just emitting carbon dioxide, it's also doing a bunch of other bad stuff. So damaged peatlands don't function in healthy ways. They don't function as, flood defense systems. They don't act as big sponges soaking up flash rainwater. They have a poor biodiversity compared to what they could be when they're functioning. There's all sorts of places where all sorts of ways in which unhappy and unhealthy peatlands, degraded peatlands, are not helping us in this fight against climate change. So I'll kind of kick this discussion off by, I mean, we've already covered quite a lot of these bits in the previous conversation, but it's good to kind of to bounce off them again by kind of asking our panelists what they think the benefits of healthy peatlands to be. And please don't just limit this to the climate benefits. Think also about the benefits for, you know, well-being, for engagement with nature, for cultural heritage and archaeological sites, all those sort of things. What are the benefits? What are we striving for in making our peatlands healthier? And then we'll talk about some of the costs of doing that. Has anyone got any of our panel got any points? I want to just jump in. Go on, Nicki, go on yourself.
Okay, so I'm going to turn that around slightly and make a slightly different point, which is sort of related to this. And that is that our lowland peats under intensive agriculture are the largest emitters of land use carbon. So anything which has been former peatland, which has been turned to agriculture, is now emitting huge amounts of carbon. But that also offers a really interesting opportunity, because those areas are being cultivated for, you know, wheat, maize, whatever, and they could quite readily be turned over to wetland generation. And if restoration of those former peatlands was actually occurring, then the UK's emissions could start to be mitigated through that process. That process of restoration could go from anything from sort of wet grass and through to fen, through to ombotrophic mire. But it also offers other opportunities, and which are really related to things like flood alleviation and so on. So thinking about how we're restoring these landscapes, not just in terms of areas that we see today as peatlands, but also thinking about former areas of peatlands, really has a fantastic opportunity. And there is an avenue through which that can be done, including things like rewilding schemes, but also through you know, payments to farmers, for instance, through the set-aside scheme. So there is actually a very practical way in which that kind of activity could be undertaken. And the other point I would make is that as archaeologists, we actually have a really good way to contribute to this, because we are uniquely placed to actually establish where these areas are. So for instance, earlier this year, a new paper was published which talked about the huge problem with tracking historical peatland areas. And basically at the moment, climate modelers are having to use a model to try and reconstruct this historic extent of peatlands. They're not using empirical data. And I think this is a really nice example of how archaeologists could potentially provide that kind of level of information. It probably wouldn't be massively accurate, but I suspect it would be a really nice start. And just thinking about some of the work we've been doing today, for instance, we're tracking, you know, peatlands, peat fills in old paleochannel systems, thinking about the extent of peatlands within the area that we're studying. And I think we could potentially provide historical values of peatlands, and therefore what the input to carbon and what the loss might be. And I think that kind of data is really helpful. So that's a sort of a rather oblique way of answering your question, which is to think more broadly than peatlands, the peatlands that we see today, and thinking about the opportunities that these other areas also provide in terms of carbon capture, but also flood alleviation and biodiversity improvement and rewilding.
Yeah, I don't think that was oblique at all. I think that was exceptionally acute, more so than my question. So I think, Rosie, you had your hand up, and then we'll go to the hands that are up in the, you know, the digital hands.
Oh, it's just a real comment really about the development of the peatland policy that's been happening, particularly in England over the last few years. That going back to what I was saying about the fact that archaeology is included is a big step forward, but in terms of the investment and time that's gone into putting those policy guidances together, you know, this is something that Ben has been working on for I dare not say how long, but certainly is a big part of his peatland career. But that it's not just also archaeologists, that actually the input has been from everybody with a sort of a peatland mind and interest, and it's been a long slog, and the fact that it's now printed is a real step forward for that development of active policy. So I think that's all I just wanted to chip in on.
Fantastic. No, I mean, please, people do go and give some of the published policy, especially Historic England's policy. It's absolutely fantastic on this. So please do go give it a read, and watch the space in Scotland, because we're halfway through. It's one of my things when I get back from annual leave. I'm actually on annual leave at the moment, but we're halfway through drafting ours alongside Nature Scot. So there will be policy coming out, and policy allows us to do things. You know, policy is quite often used as a boring word, but it allows us to actually do things. Just before I bring in Kat Hopwood-Lewis, also potentially from the policy side, I'd just quickly like to say this concept of the low-hanging fruit of peatland restoration is principally about cost. So, for example, if you look at Scotland's picture, you know, carbon capture storage artificially is an exceptionally expensive process that's going through a lot of kind of government-funded trial and error and stuff like that. We know that peatland restoration works. We know that it stops emissions, and it's also relatively cheap. In Scotland, we are looking to restore 250,000 hectares of degraded peatland by 2030. That's a lot. That's a lot of peatland. However, the funds that have been allocated for that by the Scottish Government is £250 million. Now, that's a lot of money, but for a government, it's actually not that much money. So £250 million to help stop the hemorrhaging of carbon emissions from Scotland peatlands is actually not a huge amount of money. That's what is meant by this low-hanging fruit, you know, from a governmental perspective. Yeah, please, Kat Hopwood-Lewis, the peatland expert for Natural England, who runs the grant scheme, will now speak to us about this.
Hi guys, that's a nice intro from Tom. Yeah, on the reasons to be cheerful, we've talked about trying to embed archaeology into peatland restoration. I'm the result of said embedding. I'm the embedded archaeologist for the Nature for Climate Peatland Grant Fund, which covers England, and I've just been scoring the non-carbon benefits question for our first round of restoration funding. So we've had all sorts of things come in on that. Access and engagement has been really prevalent on those answers. Obviously biodiversity. In the uplands areas, the natural flood management. There's some brilliant calculations out there, which I don't have to hand, about how much water re-wetted peat can store as opposed to degraded peat. It acts like a giant sponge, and it sucks that water up so that it decreases flashiness as it comes off the hillsides. We've also had some really off the wall suggestions. I've had at least one application referring to peat as a urban heat sink because it's adjacent to a large city, and the potential for peatland to act in that way. And we've also had some palaeoecological suggestions as well. So that's a type of wetland farming where you take products such as weeds, as reeds off there. So imagine you're kind of almost returning to a traditional land use of cultivating reeds for thatch and that kind of thing. So yeah, our scheme is primarily carbon based, but it's recognizing and scoring for all these additional things that come through. And I think it's a really positive thing to see heritage professionals in there. And I'll chip in with one last thing. Somebody mentioned the southwest of England earlier. They've formed their own regional subgroup of archaeologists involved in peatland restoration, which is Prague. It includes all 3 county archaeologists for the national park and the counties down there, representatives from industry, and we're looking to see that rolled out more widely across England and potentially Scotland if Tom wants to chip in. So look me up on LinkedIn and email me if you are interested.
Yeah, fantastic. What a timely and appropriate plug, Kat. I think that's a brilliant thing to note, that we're already seeing, as we've said, we've come as archaeologists, we quite often come late to this party, and the party's only been going on for a short amount of time, but we're already starting to see the fruits of our labours. We've got people in post like CAP, we've got grant schemes, we've got policy that's got the historic environment written into it. You know, one of my jobs for the next 6 months is to work with Peatland Action to make the kind of added benefits of cultural heritage restoration part of their grant scoring scheme. So now we'll start to see grants paid for by the Scottish Government being chosen not just based upon the carbon that the restoration will secure, but also any benefits it could bring to cultural heritage. So we're doing it. We're finally doing it. Althea, you've got your hand up, so I'll bring you to that, and then we'll go into the comments and have a look at what people have been talking about.
Well, actually, my comment is it could have been a precursor to some of the things you and Kat have just said, actually, because I was thinking one of the things that we haven't spoken specifically about in the session so far is that peat, the formation of peat, is a very slow process. Locking away all of this carbon is a very long-term process. It's happened over the Holocene in many areas, so 10,000 years worth of peat. Whereas, and if we contrast that with the pace of change that we need if we're going to effectively mitigate climate and through things like peatland restoration. So we need a really long-term thinking and long-term visions. And that's where I was thinking, people having embedded archaeologists like Kat can help us bring in that long-term vision. You may be using some of the story, the cultural heritage from the peatland record, but I think it's also interesting that some of the maybe slightly older existing wetland restoration projects that I know of, like Wick and Fen, and some of the rewilding projects, specifically woodland ones, often seem to have like a longer term vision, like 100 years into the future. And I really hope by bringing the archaeologists in more, we can kind of learn from and capitalize on that interest in other areas on having this longer term vision and having that embedded so it goes beyond the usual short policy cycles of things.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And interestingly, is one of the things that we're now in discussion with Peatland Action about in Scotland is not just setting 5 or 10 year targets, which are often enforced by which government is in place at whichever point, and they run on 5-year cycles in Scotland, but thinking 100 years in the future, what is this going to look like? And when you're doing that, then you also need to bring in the modeling for climate change, which is going to happen. And it is already happening. So, as our climate changes, the ability of peatlands to, withstand severe droughts and things changes over time. So we need to, it's a constantly sort of self-referencing cycle where the longer you think in the future, the more models you have to apply to allow you to think accurately into the future. Anyway, I'm going to go to the comments. So one from the previous chat, which I don't think got answered, is one from Michael Strategos. Do the current policies at HES or DEFRA, or the new DEFRA statement, begin to address the expansion of private-led restoration for carbon offsetting or rewilding? Are we approaching a situation in planning where ecological restorers pay for archaeological mitigation? I'll quickly jump in on this, if that's okay with people. At the moment, in the United Kingdom and Ireland, and it may be different globally, the vast majority of peatland restoration is paid for by governments. It's paid for by governments so that they can they can meet their targets on combating climate change. We may find ourselves at a point in the future where peatland restoration is used to generate carbon credits in the way that forestry is, so that companies or individuals can buy carbon credits by restoring peatland. That gets us into it's probably a good thing, and we're going to need non-government finance if we're going to restore all of our country's peatlands. But it brings us into all sorts of complicated places with who is liable for what. For example, if a peatland project causes damage to an archaeological site, who pays for that mitigation? Who pays for that restoration? At the moment, it would be funded by governments, but you need to then, if you're doing it privately or commercially, then you need to have insurance or you need to have contractors on side. That gets us into all sorts of places. So, Michael, I can't answer your question properly, but we are thinking about it, certainly in Scotland, and I'm sure that I know that Zoe Hazel at Historic England and Kat Hopwood-Lewis are also thinking about this, thinking into the long term, because it's not always going to be governments that pay for this. There will be a point when it will be will be private individuals and private companies. Let's see what other questions we have. We have Kate Foster, following up on language and Gaelic in particular. John McLean is an artist based in Lewis. Oh goodness, that's very interesting. He recently gave an overview of the Lewis Moorland glossary. Oh, and she's posted the video. Fantastic. Well, that's not really a question, so I'll allow you all to go and peruse the video. But that's fantastic to have a look at. Then we've got Alyssa. I was reading a while back on some contrasts between European bog bodies and the Windover archaeological site. Over 1,000 years of burial in one area of peat soil 7,000 years ago in Florida. Interesting because the amount of grave goods were based on. Hold on, I'm falling over myself now. How do people in the past thought about the changes at certain areas, uses, location in the record ever suggest evidence of change in cultural beliefs and practices related to peatland? Anyone in our panel want to chip in on that? You know, do we see people's perception of peatlands changing over time? I mean, we see it now in the modern era. In the modern era, we've seen it very, very rapidly. Our perception of peatlands from something to be exploited to something to be restored. Nicki, you've got your hand up. On you go.
Well, I would say historically, very much so. In fact, particularly in the last few hundred years, many people who didn't live associated with wetlands and peatlands viewed anybody who lived in these areas as living in wastelands. I mean, that's the term that was often used, particularly by Victorians. And anybody who lived in these wastelands were also seen as being rather wild and uncivilized, and definitely very poor, and to be instructed in the art of drainage and reclamation. But of course, in doing so, actually, the per capita value of land in these wetland areas was significantly higher in many cases because of wetland grazing than some of the improved areas. So there was definitely a wish to improve, but actually, I would say, far from improvement. What happened here was major loss in livelihood, land grab from commoners, loss of land rights, and a movement away from very traditional crafts in these areas. Beyond that, I suspect that people lived, in many ways, people lived in these landscapes in quite a similar way for long periods of time. Once we get out of the historical record, though, I guess it becomes harder and harder to envisage. But I definitely think there's been a civilizing force sort of in recent historical times against to change the way that these groups were living in these places. But I suspect they are very important, as they're part of our cultural heritage that is that has gone.
And I suppose it's then our job, or partially one of our many jobs as archaeologists and artists and heritage specialists and just members of the public, to make sure that the new activity within peatlands, the new government mandated activity with peatlands, is not one that ostracizes people, is not one that excludes local communities. I see Ben's got his hand up, and I'm so keen to bring him in. And then we'll go one quick question, Gareth. I know Gareth's chasing me for time while I'm saying this, so we'll go Ben, one quick question, and then we'll have to finish it. But it's too good. On you go, Ben.
Just very, very quickly. So following up questions about bogs and perceptions and how people interacted, for want of a better word, in the past. If you look at the archaeological record from Ireland, there tends to be a perception, actually in archaeological circles as much as anything, that people in prehistory were trying to just get in across bogs as quickly as possible. So we think in terms of trackways dominating the archaeological record, and those being expressions of the fact that people just wanted to get across bogs. But actually, if you look at the record itself, if you collect the information, you have actually comparatively few trackways that go all the way across bogs. Most of them go into bogs. So people are within and moving within and around bogs, particularly in the Irish Midlands, where it's all bogland there anyway. So people are interacting with bogs in various ways. They're using the resources. We also get this peculiar difference where people are also, in terms of bog bodies, which tend to dominate the popular discussion, very rare finds, that's extremely rare, but representing the use of bogs in a ritual, inverted commas, way, or votive depositional way. And some bogs are used like that, and other bogs are more kind of secular or quotidian places. And that's what's fascinating, and that's what we need to communicate more to our archaeological colleagues, is that bogs are being used in the same way any landscapes in the past are used. The archaeological record tells us that. So that's perhaps something we need to communicate, not just to the public, but also to our colleagues in archaeology, that we have these different manifestations of, I suppose, relationships with peatlands.
Yeah, fantastic. I can see that Rachel's question in the chat has been kind of answered by Althea also in the chat. So Rachel, I'm afraid I'm not going to air your question too widely, and I will really annoy Gareth if I don't close up now. There's loads of fantastic questions in here. The one from Rose is fantastic. So please, just if you want these questions to be answered at some point, feel free to email me. I think my email address is in the page for the event, and we can answer these out of that. But I will now pass back to Gareth. Thank you all so much for the theme 3 discussion. That's been great.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That was brilliant. And it's always the case with these kinds of discussion-based sessions that it always starts to kind of reach fever pitch just before we have to end everything. And I think we could all quite happily go on for another hour. But right, I mean, I'm not going to say very much now. I'm just going to conclude that part of the session and our 3 very rapid fire, but I hope rewarding discussion points. And I'm going to hand over to Nicki to give us some concluding thoughts before we call it a night. So over to you, Nicki.
Okay, thank you very much, Gareth. I'm not sure they're going to be concluding thoughts from the discussions, although I think what's quite interesting is that there's been lots of really good ideas have come forward that obviously need more time for discussion, and I guess it's prescient to then say that we are planning another roundtable event to date, but one of the purposes of today's session was really start, and I think that's a perhaps slightly unexpected ones that we can also explore, and that would be really nice to continue to discuss in the next session. So we'll probably go away and think about what's been discussed and think which of the themes that we've been talking about might then create the focus for the next roundtable. The other thing I wanted to say is that this event has been recorded, and it's will be hosted on the Glasgow University seminar series website, which Rachel has set up for the autumn, which is actually specifically focused on archaeology and climate change. And we've got a lot of really nice other talks coming up and panel discussions. Thank you, Rachel. She's just put the link up. So the recording will go there. And then finally, I'd like to mention that we've got the launch of the online exhibition, which we're frantically putting together. And we hope that will come around about the 16th of September or thereabouts. And we'll invite you to also view that material and hope that you'll find it really interesting, or at least as interesting as we're finding it in the process of putting the material together. I think that's more or less everything I wanted to say. So this is the start of an ongoing discussion, I guess. And if you've got other areas that you'd like us to focus on going forward, then I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts as well. And on that note, I'm just going to wrap up, and thank you very much for giving up part of your evening. And myself and my colleagues will hopefully go and have a bite to eat now after our day in the field. So thank you very much, everybody.